All right, for our discussion here in American History 2, we're going to be dealing with this period following the Civil War, but for the most part, it's going to be talking about the expansion of colonization into the western part of the United States, west of the Mississippi River. So we're going to do a little geography lesson, talk about where this is, the Great Plains. We'll talk about conflicts between the settlers and the American Indians that are living there. And we're going to talk a little bit about Western mythology versus Western fact, a little bit of the economics of the system, and eventually things will get sort of political, and we'll talk about the rise of one of the great sort of political movements in the United States with the Populist Party, until eventually things get sort of really out of hand, and we'll have a massive sort of election that will take place here in 1896. So the first settlers of the Great Plains are going to be the American Indians that are going to be living there. And really, even by the time of the Civil War, by the 1860s, a lot of these people were really starting to feel kind of the pinch of pushing westward settlement of Americans that were moving into this region. The Civil War, though, is just going to accelerate that process a great deal, because a lot of people are going to be fleeing the American South for political and economic reasons. The South is pretty badly smashed and destroyed. A lot of people don't want to live next door to neighbors that had maybe turned on them, or for whatever reason, they're going to be leaving the South. This is also true in part of sort of the North, not quite as much, but all of this is going to compound itself into a huge flow of immigrants into this region, which is going to then bring them directly into conflict with the American Indians living in the Great Plains. For those of you who are sort of unfamiliar with this, when I talk about the Great Plains, especially if you've lived sort of here in Florida and here in the eastern United States your whole life, you really kind of have to see it to understand what we're talking about. It's this geographic area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. It's, for the most part, flat. Arid to semi-arid grasslands for the most part. It's sort of grass almost as far as the eye can see, and the Plains Indians had really adapted themselves extremely well to living in this kind of environment. The culture that they had was that of the nomadic hunter-gatherers. They moved from place to place. They were following herds of buffalo. Typically, they didn't have permanent settlements except for their winter encampments, and so this is the lifestyle that they had adapted to for themselves. So what you would have seen in a breakdown of this culture is you would have had villages of similar language and ethnic groups. All right, they formed a rough tribal area. We, in our sort of political organization today, we draw boxes around where our place is. The Rio Grande is the edge of our box with Mexico, and then literally an arbitrary line through the snowy trees is the end of our box with Canada, and we accept that. We do that on a microcosm. My yard is here. We build fences on it, and then outside of that is somebody else's. Indians aren't quite that regimented. Their sort of rough tribal areas did and sometimes correspond to geographic features. But basically, the tribal area was determined by who's living where, how many of them are there. And so the number one, of course, cultural marker is language. The people that had the similar languages, they were the ones that would form these tribes. And of course, they all had sort of different cultural markers. But what you would have seen out in the Great Plains is people like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Apache, the Arapaho, the Nez Perce. All of them out there are going to have these tribal areas. So this is their culture. All right. These groups are polytheistic. They had sort of multiple gods. In some cases, they would refer to sort of the Great Spirit, but you also see sort of spiritual animism, animal spirit worship, ancestor spirit worship, that kind of thing. So there's no sort of one unifying religious experience that sort of cuts across all the tribal areas. But generally, they've got some similarities in this regard. They form very strong family bonds between various members of their family, their extended family, especially all throughout some of the smaller sort of villages in these outlying areas. They also had extremely sort of hard divisions of labor between men and women. So you had a big distinction between men and women in Indian culture. Men, basically, if it was a dangerous task, that was their job. They're the warriors, they're the hunters. Women, of course, are child bearers, child rearers, and are responsible for domestic chores, tending the fire, tending the clothing, cooking, that kind of thing. So, and you didn't want a lot of bleed over in this kind of realm. If you were a boy, you were trained to grow up to be sort of a hard-nosed man. If you were a girl, you were raised in such a way that you're going to be a woman of the tribe. So that's what you're seeing here. Like I mentioned, the Indians throughout this period, they're already feeling the creeping presence of settlers from the United States. As more and more people are moving into this area, and they're settling this area, we're going to see that violence is only going to increase. Okay, this is due to the fact that as more settlers move into the area, they really alter kind of the biosphere of what's going on with the food sources that the Indians depend upon. And so as a result of that, you're going to see that the Indians are going to react with a great deal of violence. Some of it's going to be cultural. You know, you're in our area, we want you out. But a lot of it is basically, survival mechanism. All right. So this is all going to be the product, as I mentioned, of people moving out of the East, especially due to the Civil War. In some cases, it's going to be to take advantage of free land from the Homestead Act. But as more and more of this violence sort of expands, we're going to see that a lot of this is actually going to be centered on the buffalo themselves. Right? So this gives you a good idea. This is a typical sort of Western kind of Great Plains Indians village. You have the teepee style of housing, where the reason for this is you've got buffalo skins that are stitched together. They form the exterior. It's all sort of put together with poles that can then be laid down, tied to the back part of a horse, and then it becomes a travois. So when you have to move, it becomes very, very quickly broken down, turned into a carrying device, and then you can move with all of your limited amounts of stuff from place to place rather rapidly. So these people have adapted themselves to living sort of in this environment. You get a little bit of the sort of truth, mostly myth, of the Great Plains. And this is Indians attacking a wagon train of settlers. This did happen, but it's sort of like plane crashes today. Plane crashes do happen, but statistically speaking, almost never. They almost never happen. But everybody, if you ever fly, if you ever flown, every time I fly, you're worried, oh man, the plane's going to crash, right? So the same thing was true here. Indian attacks on wagon trains, they did happen. They were not, fictional. But for the most part, they didn't. But the settlers, of course, they're constantly worried about this. They're going into a wilderness. It could be full of hostile Indians. And so it's sort of real, sort of not real, to give you an idea of kind of how this works itself out. This is something I've got the comic uploaded to the website. I've often contended that nobody explains history quite like walking, talking, eating blue crabs. And so this is Chester the Crab, and he kind of explains a little bit of Indian culture of what's going on there, so you can check that out for yourself. Right? Really, the centerpiece of all of this for the Indians was the buffalo. Right? I know that technically it's the North American bison. Buffalo is actually an Asian and whatever. Okay, people have been calling them buffalo in this continent for a few hundred years. I'm not going to stop just because you're supposed to call it something else. So this is the center of their basic subsistence and lives. So the buffalo provides their food. They eat its meat. Going to provide their clothing, right, from its hide. Again, it's going to help them provide shelter in that regard. They can take their bones and their horns and their hooves and make tools and home items. Their skulls become these religious talismans, and even buffalo manure becomes fuel for their fires, because you're not going to see a lot of trees out on the Great Plains. Basically, everything that the Indians required to live, the buffalo provided a huge percentage of that, right? And you're going to see that their culture is reflexive of that, because the mobility of the Indian tribes were related to the fact they had to follow these herds of buffalo that would move into an area. They sort of eat down the prairie grass, and okay, there's nothing else to eat here, and then they sort of herd on elsewhere. And so the Indians have to be able to follow these guys during the hunting seasons in order to store up food and all the other items that they're going to need for the winter. So the settlers, they really understood this. It was not sort of hard to figure out that the Indians were completely dependent upon the buffalo. So if you're having a lot of problems with the Plains Indians, one of the easy ways to get rid of the Indians is to just get rid of the buffalo. And you're going to see that throughout this period, the settlers began a campaign of, in some cases, purposeful slaughter. One, to harvest these buffalo for sort of their own purposes. Two, purposeful for, let's just get rid of the Indians. And in some cases, recreational slaughter. Of the buffalo as basically a means to eliminate the Indians. And so for those of you who have absolutely no idea what the North American bison looks like, this is it, this buffalo, right? Great big woolly hump. giant thing roaming around the plains of the American West. And actually, at one point, it covered the range of the buffalo was most of the continent. I mean, you could find them anywhere. This is pretty typical classical Indian hunting styles. You see the guys in the background, they've got the bow and arrow. You can see the guy in the foreground, he's got the spear. And of course, you got to ride up alongside this thing and stab it. So it took a great deal of courage to go toe-to-toe with one of these things to bring it down. But this is the Indians' lifestyle, and this is how they made their living. Here you can see an Indian medicine man going through one of his religious rituals, and he's got the painted up sort of skull. I'm not exactly sure what he's doing, but other than religious activities. But it gives you an idea of kind of where they're going with this. But like I said, the people coming into the region are trying to get rid of the buffalo. One of the problems that you'll see the railroads as they go throughout the Great Plains that they had is the fact that the buffalo don't have any. They don't have any fear. There's nothing that other than people that sort of hunt the buffalo, and so they're sort of munching along, and so they didn't develop a lot of natural fear of things that other animals are sort of skittish about. So for those of you that are hunters, you know that gunfire really scares animals. Buffalo, not so much. Loud trains, whatever, right? And so one of the problems that the railroads had was the buffalo would just sort of wander onto the tracks, and if you don't have enough sort of sight line to see a buffalo coming and slow the train down and try to nudge it out of the way, the buffalo is just going to stand there and it's going to get run over. And their carcass would get under the wheels, and it would dislodge the wheels, and it would derail the train, and massive, massive problems would ensue. So they tried to install, the little cow catchers on the front and try to shove the buffalo out of the way, but that wasn't 100% successful. So one of the things they found that was really successful was you just give all the passengers guns, and all the crew of the train guns. You just have them shoot the buffalo. And actually, some of these railroad lines, they would actually advertise this, and they would say, "Hey, shoot some buffalo while you go through the wilderness." And in some cases, they would just be riding along and see buffalo out there, and they'd hand out rifles to the passengers, and they'd take shots at them. Oh, we hit one, and it would go down. But for the railroads, it was good to get these things out of the way. They were causing problems for their business, and of course, it would, as a nice little added bonus, it would get rid of the Indians as well. So this was something that they didn't have to deal with. Buffalo hide and buffalo tongue, though, throughout this period had become real valuable commodities. A lot of people wanted buffalo skin rugs and buffalo skin, wall adornments and buffalo heads, I don't know. But buffalo pelts, and then restaurants at this point, you didn't order filet mignon, you ordered buffalo tongue. All right? It was the expensive thing that you would eat. And it was apparently really tasty. I've never eaten a buffalo's tongue, but apparently you could make a lot of money at this, and so this attracted a huge number of hunters throughout the 1860s and then on into the 1870s especially, when you just got this massive sort of slaughter of buffalo for these hunters that are trying to harvest, just parts of them, because they don't have the carrying capacity to carry off entire carcasses, so they just strip them down to things that are easily carried, tongues, pelts, sometimes horns, a couple other things, but for the most part, just their pelts and their tongues. And so you'll see these guys. This is a chart that gives you an idea of kind of how much killing is going on. These are some of the sort of the Hall of Fame buffalo hunters, and how effective these guys were. Some of them, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 kills in a single year. And then a few of these guys have career hunters, career hunting numbers. J. Wright Moore, over 20,000. And you start realizing there's a lot of lesser guys that didn't make this list. And you got tens of thousands and tens of thousands year after year after year. The buffalo is essentially hunted almost to extinction. And so what we're going to see is that is going to push the Indians closer and closer to extinction as well. So as more and more of these settlers are pushing into this area, the Indians are going to push back. And you're going to have attacks on settlers increasing, and the settlers are going to do exactly what you would do if somebody came and attacked you, and that's you're going to call for help from the government. And so in this regard, instead of sending the police, like they might if somebody's breaking into your house, they're going to send in the army. They're going to send in the army to crush this Indian resistance, starting in the late 1860s, and then all into the 1870s and 1880s. And you're going to see attacks and counterattacks and reprisals, and it is really, really ugly. Okay, the fighting is going to take place here. You will see a major sort of blow-off battle that's going to take place at the Little Bighorn in the 1870s. This is one of the most famous of these. where you've got George Armstrong Custer, who had led one campaign already against the Cheyenne Indians, and then he's going to lead another campaign here against the Lakota Indians in the Dakotas. And Custer was a Civil War hero, but he found that life in the Army after the armies were not these huge sort of, volunteer armies of fighting civil wars. That peacetime army's kind of hard. You've got to work really hard to sort of make a name for yourself, and he became kind of a glory whore. And he wanted to get his name in the papers, and he wanted to get promoted, and so he wanted to make sure that he was the one that defeated the Lakota Indians, and so he went after these guys. And basically, he runs into this very large encampment of about 5,000 Lakota Indians, and so you're going to have a little less than half that are going to be the warriors. So somewhere around about 2,500 Lakota Indians are going to come out. He's going to fight these guys with part of his command, 264 men. And exactly what you would think of 264 versus 2,500 or so is pretty much what happened. When you're outnumbered 10-1, you're probably going to get defeated, and that's exactly what happens to Custer. Custer gets his men killed, he gets himself killed, and this is a big victory for the Indians, but it is impermanent. What we're going to see is subsequent campaigns are, just like we see with all the other Indian wars throughout the history of North America, they're going to turn against the tribal people. All right? The warfare itself was extremely brutal. You saw mutilation of bodies, torture of prisoners. It was really, really ugly and gross. All right? But the Army has a big, the United States Army has a big weapon on its side, and that's starvation. All right? Basically, you push these people to the limit, and eventually they will give up and quit, and that's exactly what happens. Generally speaking, what we're going to see is by 1890 or so, all these Indians are forced onto reservations to keep them out of the way of the settlers. And for, if you're still thinking, like 1920, 1930, that you're worried about like Indian raids, it's just not going to happen. Even really by, for the most part, 1900, it wasn't going to happen. So here you can see an artist's rendition of what it looks like. These Custer's men are kind of forced onto this hillside, the Little Bighorn River kind of in the background. These guys are trying to fight off the huge number of waves of Lakota Indians that are attacking them, and eventually they would succumb to this. This is a little more fanciful idea that the artist had of kind of the heroic Custer. All of his men sort of go around, down around him, and he's the last man standing. He's got a pistol in each hand. He's sort of fighting off the Indians, and very heroically he sort of lays down his life for America. This is all born, for those of you who have heard this, Custer was a hero kind of thing. This is all born from actually World War II. In the early days of World War II, the United States was having its butt handed to it by the Axis powers basically on a daily basis. And they needed somebody in American history who held out just against long odds and sacrificed of himself. So when you've got, like U.S. Marines basically fighting against the Japanese in a battle that, one, they can't win, two, they can't survive, you need somebody to inspire Americans to say, hey, look, we're going to have to fight, and we may just all have to die. So they pulled this guy Custer out, and they sort of did a fix-up job on his history. And so he became kind of a propaganda tool for a year or two in World War II for the United States government, that you just fight hard, you just do your bit, and be heroic like Custer. Custer's last stand, he went down blazing. The guy was an idiot, okay? He was a glory hound, and he got himself and his men killed because he was an idiot. But that doesn't play well in propaganda circles. So if you've heard that, sort of Custer was a hero kind of thing, that's where it comes from. And that's why it's like that, because it served a useful purpose. While we try not to lie to ourselves about history, the United States government wanted to win World War II, because as bad as, sort of telling fibs about history is, having Hitler conquer the earth is a whole lot worse. So that's what you're going to see here. This is after one of the Indian massacres that take place. One of the things that the U.S. Army learned fairly quickly is that if you can find these people at their winter encampment, they're not as mobile. They don't move around as much in the wintertime. And so you can see the snow on the ground and the guy with the thick coat on. That's what you do. You ride into the village and you kill all the people. End of problem. William T. Sherman, who had been the general that came up with the idea of sort of burning the South down so that way it can't fight us anymore, and whether you agree or disagree with that policy, he is now, his friend Ulysses S. Grant is now president in the late 1860s and on into the 1870s. And so Sherman now finds himself basically the top general in the United States Army. And during some of these Indian campaigns, one of his junior officers that come up to Sherman General Sherman, when we go into the village, should we kill the women and children? And Sherman's reply was, well, nits make lice, right? So, yeah, if you kill the women and children, then we won't have another generation of Indians that we'll have to kill in 20 years. So, that's pretty cold-hearted, but that was the policy the United States followed. So they would go in here, they'd burn these Indian villages down, you'd slaughter everybody that you would find, and that's how you deal with it. So it was pretty harsh types of warfare that you would see with this as well. Now, when I ask you to think about cowboys, right, it's almost sort of ingrained in our DNA that now certain images kind of come to the fore for a long time in American entertainment history, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, started breaking down a little bit in the 1960s. But if you were an actor, at some point you played a cowboy, or if you were an actress, you played like a cowboy's wife or girlfriend or something like that. You were just in a ton of westerns. That's just how things went in entertainment. You were going to spend a lot of time riding around on a horse, shooting a pistol at somebody off camera. That's just how it was. And so we saw for a long time a lot of people, wearing cowboy hats and being out west and riding horses and stuff like that. So when you think about the cowboy, there's a certain kind of image that comes to your mind, and it's fairly fully formed. Even while the cowboy culture was taking off, people were mythologizing it for fictional purposes as it was happening. So it's a really interesting kind of thing that holds this mystique in American history. So we'll talk about that a little bit, but we're going to talk about now the reality of this, okay? The reality of this is all based on money, all right? This is a job that people had, so that way they could get resources for themselves, and they could sell a product that other Americans wanted, all right? The root cause of all this is the expansion of the American rail network, all right? Railroads are going out, they're starting to penetrate into the West, all right? A little bit. And so what happens is these cattle ranchers in Texas realize that if they could go around and round up a lot of these free-range, free-roaming longhorn cattle, along with a few other ones, they could make a great deal of money, because a lot of these cows they're just kind of out there. You just go and you get them, and you rope them, and you herd them together, and you put your brand on them, and they become yours. But while Americans would pay a lot of money for beef, all right, they'd be willing to pay for this at the growing urban centers of the East, how do you get them there? You're in South Texas, they're in Chicago, they're in New York, they're in Pittsburgh. You're not going to herd them overland. But you don't have to do that, because all you have to do is get them to the closest rail line. You get them to the rail line, and the rail line will take them to the stockyards of Chicago, of St. Louis, of these other places, that then they can transport them again using the railroads to the restaurants of New York or wherever it is that you're going. But by that point, you'll have sold them to that. So all you have to do is get them to the rail lines that are close by, and in this case, it's the rail lines in Kansas. But you are going to have to then drive these herds from Central and South Texas overland. So that is going to necessitate the use of these people that we came to call cowboys, to get them to these places that ever increasingly catered to this type of business, that would have pen facilities and then amenities for the cowboys, and they became known as cow towns. Most famous of these was Dodge City, Kansas, but there are a number of other ones all along the railroad lines in Kansas as a result of that. Very early on, when this was getting started, less so as more and more people got into the business, the bosses that ran this, they made some pretty good profits off of this. But the cowboys themselves, they didn't live this sort of romantic life where they go in and they fight these sort of duels with each other in the streets, and they're out sleeping amongst the stars. They're living on the ground. They're living with dust. They don't take a bath for weeks on end. They get paid not a whole lot of money, all right? And, they're eating beans, they're drinking coffee, they're working. In some cases, these guys have to work for 24 hours straight, because somebody's got to watch the cows at night. It's not like you can just sort of send them an email and say, all right, you guys stay here while we take a nap. So there's dust everywhere, there's privation. It's really hard living, okay? If you don't believe me, go outside and spend the night sleeping on the ground tonight. That'll convince you that it's not a whole lot of fun, okay? So of course, they don't get paid until the end, and when they do get paid, they get paid exactly what you would expect somebody who's working a minimum wage kind of job would get paid, which is, we can find anybody that can ride around and, herd cattle. They don't get paid a whole lot. Now, once they arrive at these cow towns, the cow towns are going to help them relieve themselves of what little money they have by providing all the things that somebody who's been stuck in the wilderness for weeks on end are going to need, such as food, liquor, shows, female diversion. And basically all this kind of entertainment is going to be available to them for a fee. All right. So I don't want to totally dump on these guys, because when you read about them writing about their lives, they do say, well, it is sort of free living. They're out by themselves. But they generally also complain that as soon as I get enough money, I'm going to get a house. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to do something like that, so I don't have to sleep on the ground. Because you do have a very tough lifestyle. You're also going to see that out in the Great Plains here. This cowboy culture is a very diverse one, where you got a lot of white cowboys, you got a lot of Anglos, but you're going to have a lot of black cowboys, and you're also going to have a strong influence of Hispanic cowboys that are going to be coming up out of Mexico and involved in this culture as well. In fact, you'll see a lot of our terminology. Ranch comes from ranchero, you get the lariat. All of these kinds of terminology that you'll see is borrowed from the vaquero culture, the cowboy culture of Mexico, that is going to sort of cross the border into Texas and into Arizona and these places as well. So you would have run into a lot of different people with a lot of different ethnic backgrounds as a result of being out here on the Great Plains. Well, eventually what you're going to see is the economics begins to change. Railroads begin to work their way into Texas itself. You'll see that, for example, a lot of these free-range guys are going to lose huge numbers of herds in a very bad sort of blizzard storm that's going to take place in the late 1880s. And it becomes a better business model to have your own ranches, to have very large sort of tracts of land where you sort of raise your own cattle from your own stock on it and then transport it not nearly as far to the railroad heads that are in Texas. And basically, this is the model that a lot of the beef business uses today, which is you sort of raise your own stock, you fatten it up, and then you sell it to people that are fairly easy to transport. So that way you don't have to go hundreds of miles overland through the wilderness. So the cattle frontier eventually does come to a close as a result of that, but it radically alters American lifestyles. It gives us American mythology, and of course, it alters the American diet. An ever-increasing amount of beef is beginning to replace pork as the protein sources for a lot of the American diet. So here's the fiction. When we think of cowboys, we think of sort of gunfights and these guys who are sort of living wild and crazy lives, shoot out at sort of Tombstone, Wyatt Earp and some of these other guys. And while that did happen, a lot of what we consider sort of these sort of wild gunfights that are going on all the time, no, that's really not what happened. That's the fiction. The fact of it is this: you're riding long distances, you're sleeping on the ground, you're eating horrible food, there's dust everywhere, and you have to look after a giant herd of cows. It's really not a whole lot more exciting than that. It's a job that you do. This is Deadwood Dick, to give you an idea of kind of the diversity of the Plains. He's an African-American cowboy. He was sometimes referred to as king of the cowboys, although you shouldn't imply from that cowboys had a monarchical system of government. He was one of the sort of great cowboys in terms of roping and riding and things like that here in the late 19th century. And so this gives you an idea a little bit of the culture of what's going on in the cattle frontier. All right. Main group of people, though, that we're going to be talking about here is going to be the farmers, sort of the average, sort of middle-of-the-road family farmer. And this is all going to be the sort of the rise and the crash of all of this is going to basically, we're going to be able to pretty easily lay this at the feet of the government, sort of like basically every economic crash that we've pretty much had in American history. The government tried to do something good, and it worked out okay for a while, and then it caused people a whole lot of pain. That's the government for you, okay? In this case, it's going to be the 1862 Homestead Act. You see, when Congress, in their infinite wisdom, sort of, when they look at the American West, they just see a whole bunch of empty, useless land that could be put to some kind of productive purpose. And aren't farmers awesome? Well, yeah, farmers are awesome. And so what they basically did was the 1862 Homestead Act would give 160 acres of land to any family for dirt cheap, for like 30 bucks, okay? Basically, a horse and a half. I think a good horse at this point was like $20. So if you could afford a horse and a half, you could afford 160 acres of land, all right? The idea was, though, that you would go out and farm it. You had to provide improvements for it, was the way that it worked, all right? Well, basically, you're giving away 160 acres of land in these tracts, okay? This is going to cause exactly what you would think to cause, and that is farmers are going to start heading west in droves, all right? Because 160 acres of land, that's not just, well, I'll live on it and I'll raise enough like potatoes or something to keep me and my family alive. No, 160 acres of land, you can't eat 160 acres of land. I mean, you would be like fatter than Jabba the Hutt if you ate that kind of food, all right, every year. I mean, if you had 20 children, they can't eat this much. So the idea is that they're going to be farming it, they'll turn it into a productive purpose, and then you sell the surplus. So now you've created these huge little business people. Well, sounds great, okay? One of the other factors that you're going to see here is a massive mining boom is going to take place in various places. Most famous of this is Tombstone, Arizona, where they find a great big silver strike. You'll see silver strikes and gold strikes and stuff like that. These people are going to be heading out west, and for the most part, they're all going to bust, because why would you be in Tombstone, Arizona if there's no silver? And some of the Tombstone's a really good example. At one point, Tombstone, I think, was like the 4th most populated city in the United States. It went from being this dry, arid ridge, you know, there's no reason to be there, to being incredibly populated. And then when the silver runs out, everybody realizes, oh yeah, there's no reason to be here. And they all leave. You guys can go to Tombstone today. It's a ghost town, right? They have tours for this. So what happens to all these people when these mining towns bust? They go from boom town to bust town. Well, a lot of these former miners are going to turn into farmers, okay? So the problem is, of course, you're way out in the middle of nowhere, but you've got 160 acres worth of wheat or soybeans or whatever it is you're growing out there, all right? How do you get it to market? Well, you can throw it all on these wagons, but it's going to take you forever. The railroads are going to be the one that are going to provide that business link. That's what makes living on 160 acres worth of land, instead of just saying, hey, you got a whole lot of land, to being, no, you're now a viable small business person, because you need your business model to work out so that you can get your product to market in a reasonable amount of time. And that's what's going to take place here, is the railroads make it all possible. You don't have to get it to the market, you just have to get it to the railroad. The railroad can take it to the market very, very quickly. So these farms, especially throughout this area, are going to be growing grains. Wheat and corn are going to dominate, and a few other things as well. But those are going to be the two main ones, which is why when you drive from Kansas to Nebraska today, it looks like you're sort of drowning in an ocean of corn. All right? And so the rails are going to get this product to market before it spoils. Now, as these people move out, one of the things you have to understand is they're pioneers. Okay? Life on the Great Plains is pretty harsh. Okay? The settlers, you have to be able to be tough, hardworking, and independent, or you have to learn to be dead. So there's no sort of middle ground. You either learn to do your own doctoring in some cases, or you learn to be a corpse. You have to learn to fight off the Indians maybe and shoot straight and on time, or you have to learn to be a dead guy. So you got to make your own clothes, you got to make your own house, you got to do all this stuff yourself. One of the other problems, of course, that you're going to find is the fact that this area is pretty arid, which means there's not a lot of rain. So they've got to develop ways to cope with this problem. And you'll see that the early methods of regulating basically every drop of water that's out there is going to be the ones that are going to be sustained today. So if you go out west, you go to places like Colorado and some of these other places where you get these weird like water contracts with the government, who gets first dibs on what drop of water. That dates all the way back to the 19th century and is a major factor in how they did business then with water, how they do business now. But what you're going to see is this continues to expand. These people continue to move into the Great Plains. And one of the things that the United States government has always kept track of, basically since it started taking a census in 1790, was a frontier line. Meaning that civilization of the United States kind of went up to a certain point, and then beyond this little line they would draw on the map, beyond that was wild territory. Now, the frontier had existed since American colonists started showing up in the 1600s. There was a frontier. Okay. Now, in 1605, the frontier was, you throw a rock into the forest, and when the Indians would shout, "Ow!" that was the frontier. Okay, it was right there in front of you. It was places where there are mini malls now. All right. It's hard to think of, northern New Jersey as having, being right on the frontier. But that frontier would push ever westward. What happens here is by 1890, the director of the U.S. Census Bureau tells the President of the United States the frontier's gone. There's no frontier anymore. So essentially, after 300 years of having a frontier, of a place to send future generations of Americans to pioneer and to work and to civilize and to change the land and to farm it and to build businesses and railroad tracks and all roads and all this kind of stuff, that's not a thing anymore. do not think that that does not have a profound psychological impact on a nation that was at least partially dependent upon having a frontier, a wild area in which to expand. A lot of people, that's just how things have been for several hundred years. What do we do now? Okay, we'll talk about that in one of the other chapters. This is important for this. How do you build a house without trees? All right. If you go to see some of these pioneer cabins down here in Florida or anywhere really in the eastern United States, you got these wicked cool, log, pine, chestnut tree, cabins, and they're really sort of impressive. Okay. Problem with building a house out here on the Great Plains is there's no trees. There's not a lot of trees, and so what do you build your house out of? Well, you gotta make do with what you have. This is what's called a soddy, or a sod house. And you see, since there's not a lot of rain on the Great Plains, the grasses that grow there have to develop such a hard, extensive, thick root system in order to basically leach out every single drop of rain that does fall occasionally. It's almost like concrete. Well, not quite that bad, but in some cases the roots are that thick. And so what they would do is you just start carving out these chunks and you make these blocks out of the thick, hard root system of these plants. And you start piling up like bricks, and you make yourself a little house. When it rains, it leaks because it's roots. It's not a roof. In the springtime, the roof of your house flowers, which is kind of nice. All right, it gets a little drafty. But this is one that you can see has undergone a few improvements, right? That the basic structure of it is a sod house, but they've added, they've imported into the area, metal stovepipes and things like that for internal heating. They have managed to build a wood frame door. They brought in some glass for a window. But this is what life is like on the Great Plains. You live in a house made out of basically dirt and grass. So you either put up with it and you're tough enough to handle it, or you wind up dead. So this is it. Can't give enough credit to these pioneer women. They got to do a lot of the same work as the men and do it while sort of giving birth to the next generation of American children. So here you can see you got to be tough, hard-nosed, independent, handle the elements, and do it all in a skirt. So, way to go, ladies, with this as well. When we talk about the economics of this, though, you've got to understand kind of how this begins to play out over time. And as more and more people are being coaxed by the government into a market that not all of them would have been, you're going to see that the government is basically putting its thumb on the scale of the economy. And again, basically every time it does that, it causes massive problems. This is going to be no different, right? What you're going to see here is, though, immediately following the Civil War, farm prices are actually pretty high, all right? You can make a decent amount of money. A lot of the farms in the East have been wrecked and destroyed, and you got a lot of dead farmers from the Civil War, and so if you were one of the surviving farmers and you're getting into this region fairly early, you're going to be able to make a decent amount of money, which, of course, as word of that filtered back to other people, hey, they're making a lot of money, let's go and let's do that as well. One of the other issues, too, is when we talk about the railroad industry and how they began to operate. A lot of these railroad monopolies right after the war hadn't really quite formed yet, and so they're not able to put the squeeze on the farmers quite yet, right? What you're going to see is some of these western farms, in fact, got bigger and bigger, and they basically would form what we call a bonanza farm. This was actually I think the longest-running TV show in American history, although, I don't know, maybe Law & Order has eclipsed it by now. But that was Bonanza. It was this western show. And it was based on the idea, though, that you had these huge, massive sort of western farms. And basically what it was a giant agricultural factory. If you've ever seen one of the giant sort of automotive construction plants or any major sort of industrial plant anywhere in America, it's like that except with agriculture. You get this huge amount of arable land, you've got a very large workforce, you bring these guys, they all live on it, they work there, they send the products off, they sell it, okay? And so you're going to have an ever-increasing number of people that are trying to get into this business. Well, if you know anything about economics, all right, as the supply of this product, in this case agriculture, increases, that means that the price of it is going to decrease because you've got more and more people that are getting into the farming business, okay? And that's going to cause falling prices, which means that the farmers aren't going to be making a whole lot of money. You're also going to see at this point they've got rising costs. The railroads are really figuring out that they are the ones that can charge whatever they want because the farmers have to pay whatever they charge. And so, ever increasingly, by the late 1880s, Western farmers are getting hit pretty hard. Now, what's interestingly enough is really the root cause of all this is the government sort of poking all these people and saying, we need this massive wave of sort of middle-class farmers. They all need to go out, so we're going to hand out land as a result of that. Instead of allowing the market to handle, how many farmers do we really need? How much food do we really need and willing to pay for, and at what prices? Which it would have done probably almost perfectly. Instead, now you've got a whole bunch of people that have been sent out there by the government to farm, and now they're dealing with the fact that there's too many of them. But that's the government for you. So these farmers wind up, ironically, blaming big business, because at this point, and we'll talk about this in one of the other sections, is business is doing extremely well in industrialization. They're making lots of money. They're forming corporations. They're doing, because for the most part, they're left alone by the government, and so they're doing what you need to do, which is they're pooling their money, they're going into these enterprises, they're creating efficient businesses, and they're making very real profits. These guys, on the other hand, are kind of going in the other direction. And it's not hard to figure out why, because it's incredibly inefficient to have this giant wave of sort of middle-class farmers instead of doing what everything else in the economy is doing, which is creating very large organizations that are backed by big capital that can then make it a very efficient use of land and labor and things like that, which is basically how we do agriculture now. These massive corporations, they rent out fields, they send in work crews, they got a lot of mechanization, they get the food out very efficiently, and that's why when you go to the store, you can, for the most part, afford food. Unlike some other countries, which they don't do it this way, and it's extremely difficult to eat. Right? So what's going to be ironic is they're going to petition the government to help them out of this, which is sort of like petitioning the poison bottle, to make you feel better after you actually accidentally swallow some. But this is the idea, is they feel that the big businesses, especially of the industrialized East, the banks and the railroads, that they've sort of got their eyes on them, and that the government is kind of ignoring them. So they form their own political movement to try to achieve these goals to gain parity. This is one of these bonanza farms, to give you an idea of kind of how big some of these are. It's like, oh, that's a barn. But you got to remember, that little speck down there, that's like the size of a person. You realize that that's a gigantic barn, right? And so these are some of the workers' houses and some of the other buildings that they would have had on these farms. Obviously, this is a much, much later photograph because it's taken from an airplane, which they wouldn't have had in the late 1800s. But it gives you basically an idea of some of what's going on with this. So all of this political activity is going to lead to a movement that we often refer to as populism, and eventually the populist party, all right? And you'll see that it's going to have its roots initially in these organizations of farmers that would get together. And one of the most important of these was the Grange. The Grange movement is where these farmers would get together and they would talk about the technical aspects of farming. Soil erosion and farm technology and how to get goods to market and the problems of transportation. But as they would do that, hey, well, I got real problems with the railroads. The railroads really, screwing us over. Yeah, I think so. The government's really kind of ignoring. Yeah, the government's really ignoring us. So you see all these conversations that the Grange movement also began to spawn, okay? And the Grange would then spawn these loyal politicians as people would step forward and say, hey, I'll do something about this, right? I'll get elected and I'll put our views into, initially, we're going to see state and local governments. And the places where you're going to see the Grange most successful is, of course, the places where agriculture is a more dominant industry, the West and the South, right? So eventually what you're going to see is to get themselves more and more organized, instead of just sympathetic politicians, you're going to see that these guys decide to form their own political party, and they call it the Populist Party, okay? Now, for the most part, again, these names that political parties pick for themselves, they really don't have a whole lot of meaning, all right? The Republican Party, well, we have a republic, we live in one, all right? We have a Republican form of government. And the Democratic Party, well, we use democratic principles to elect the Republican government. So it's just, they sound good. Populist Party, for those of you who don't speak Latin, it just means the People's Party, right? Which, of course, is, it's a cool name. Well, we're for the people. Well, what political party isn't? Anyway, they form themselves the Populist Party, and it really gets going here by the 1890s. And they begin a pretty successful string. They begin winning seats in the states, state legislatures, and various other levels of government. But the problem that they've got, of course, is a lot of these railroads run across state lines, and they want to regulate big business across state lines, and the only way to do that is to get power in Washington. They eventually come up with two sort of main planks for their party. One of them, yeah, you know, it's pretty consistent, and it makes a certain amount of sense. All right. The other one is just literally, you know, sort of out on the prairies, kind of, you know, you've been in the sun too long, kind of crazy. All right. I'll deal with the second one, the first, which is the one that makes the most sense. They want to see the government regulate trusts, these big sort of corporations that we'll talk about in another section. They want to see the government come in, and they want to see them kind of keep them under control. And so they want the government to come in and regulate these things. And so they don't want them to get out of hand. They feel it really it's sort of big business versus them. Not exactly what's going on, maybe partially, but that's how they feel, and there's a certain amount of sense to that. The other one just doesn't make any sense at all, right? It does on a surface level, but then after a while, it just wouldn't, all right? Their plan here is for the United States government to inflate its currency by allowing the free coinage of a lot of the silver that's being mined out of the western United States at this point, and basically devaluing the American currency. Now, the reason that they want to do that, normally, wait a minute, that would mean the value of your dollar is less. Why would you want to do that? The reason for this, all right, is farming is a debt business. You go into debt first, and then you get paid at the end when the crops come in, okay? And if you don't get all the crops to come in, then, you know, you stay in debt. And some of these guys had some pretty healthy debt for land and equipment and seed and all this other stuff that they had to go into debt for the banks for. So the way that it would work is, at least according to the populace, is if you allow the free coinage of silver and the inflation of the money supply, that means that farmers then are going to be able to charge more. The prices go up. Prices go up under inflation. They're going to be getting this money in very larger quantities, all right? And then they can pay off their debt faster. Because, you know, you borrow $500 from the bank, but if you get $500 that's not worth quite as much because of inflation, you're going to get it back faster and you can pay the banks off. Now, if you're sitting here thinking, wait a minute, does the bank really want to get paid off with $500 that's not worth as much as the $500 that they loaned however many years ago? No, they don't. No, they don't. So banks are going to be very much against this because basically they're going to be paid back in money that's worth a whole lot less than the same amount of money they loaned out a few years earlier. But this is the idea. The farmer, we're going to get out of debt by inflating the currency, and that'll get us out of debt. The reason that it doesn't make any sense, okay, is because the next time they have to go and borrow money is they're going to have to borrow the inflated money, which means that the debt is going to get bigger. And then they've got to basically try to pay it off with inflated money. So the only way that this would work, just totally in the farmer's favor, is if you constantly are having inflation. You've got to have, you know, you can't just do it once. You've got to have it constantly. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And what this means, though, okay, is now you've got two sides in the 1896 election. That one's going to be free coinage of silver, inflation, farmers, blah, blah, blah. And the other side is, no, if you do that, you'll crash the economy, you'll cause all these problems. And so in some cases, what you're going to see is, you know, elections come down to kind of personalities, you know. Well, they're both kind of saying the same thing. Which person do we really think would do a better job? Maybe this person, maybe that person. This person looks good in the suit. That person looks good on TV. Whatever. A lot of elections, you know, they don't come down to a lot of issues. I mean, sometimes, you know, just a few. There's always some. But in a lot of cases, they don't come down to, it's like, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do A. And then the other candidate's like, no, I'm going to do B. And there's going to be a huge difference policy-wise between what you're going to get. 1896 was one of those, where you had huge policy differences between these. And this is a political cartoon to give you an idea. This is William Jennings Bryan of the Populist Party, and he's the snake that is eventually going to swallow the Democrat Party here in 1896. So when we look at this election here in 1896, it gives you a good idea of kind of what is going on with this political movement. All right. Now, the populist champion at this point, as I mentioned, is a guy named William Jennings Bryan. He gets himself nominated by the populists, but he's also a Democrat, and he goes to the Democrat convention, and he gives this cross of gold speech. All right, where he mixes, you know, religious imagery with the issues of the day. And basically, he describes the fact that, if we don't do right by the farmer, grass is going to grow in the streets of America because people won't have enough to eat. And he argues against the gold standard, which was what the other side was arguing. He wanted free silver. They wanted to stick to the gold standard, limited money supply. And basically he says, you will not press down on our heads this crown of thorns. You will not crucify us to a cross of gold. People sat in stunned silence when he finished his speech, and then they began applauding, and they began going nuts. And it completely swayed the Democrat convention in his favor. And so it was his argument that free silver was what was going to save America. So William Jennings Bryan gives this mind-blowing kind of speech and gets himself nominated by the Democrats on a total populist free silver platform. All right? The Republicans nominate basically almost a polar opposite, okay, in order to hold up their end. And that's going to be Ohio Senator William McKinley. All right? And so you've got a tale of two candidates, a tale of two campaigns that really couldn't be any more different. All right, William Jennings Bryan. If you were to ask most people in the 1890s America, who's the greatest speaker that we have? Who's the great public speaker that we have? And most people that knew anything about it was, it's William Jennings Bryan. I mean, the guy just can't talk. He just knows how to whip up a crowd. He knows what he's doing. Bryan would go from place to place. He would campaign for himself. In some cases, I was reading about this one where he's campaigning, and he campaigns until he passes out. And then they revive him, and he just starts campaigning again. Right? And so he would do this. All right, all throughout the South, all throughout the West, getting farmers on his side. All right. McKinley, on the other hand, he's pretty quiet. He's unassuming. He campaigns from the back porch of his house. He sort of sits there, and then supporters come in, and he gives these little short speeches, and he says, "Okay, this is what I'm going to do, and this is what I'm all about, and now you need to go out and get other people to vote for me." And I said, "Okay." And then the next group, after a few minutes, they'd come in and he'd give another speech. But yeah, basically he ran from his house in Ohio, and he's pretty quiet, and he's pretty dull by comparison to William Jennings Bryan. Of course, most of us are compared to William Jennings Bryan. And he, of course, was for the gold standard and consistency. Right? He had a pretty cool campaign slogan, the gold standard and full dinner pail, which, the idea was that, hey, if the other guy gets elected, the economy's going to go crazy, and we'll all starve to death. So, okay. So Bryan is going to appeal to farmers. That's going to be his base. He's going to go out and he's going to appeal to this, salt the earth, and he's going to lose. What you're seeing is this is very indicative of the transition that America is going towards. He's going to win the South. He's going to win the West. But ever increasingly, you're seeing that Americans are north and they are east. Okay? These Eastern workers, these people who have jobs, they fear inflation because they go to the store and then their wages can't buy enough food. They get paid in money. They're not small businessmen like all these farmers that the government had enticed to go out there. They have a job, they punch a clock, and they get paid at the end of the day, and they got to go to the store and they got to buy food at the grocery store. And if inflation takes place, that means that their dollar doesn't go as far, and so they don't like this. And so what you're seeing here is these industrial workers, that increasingly they're becoming the majority. America is becoming a more urban nation rather than a rural one, and so you're going to see that at least politically, at least initially, populism is going to go down to defeat. So there's a political cartoon. There's William Jennings Bryan. He's got the cross of gold in one hand. He's got his crown of thorns in the other one. Like I said, he's making this religious imagery that's so stunning and so captivating, but it loses. And so when you look up the map, William Jennings Bryan, he wins the South, he wins the West, but the electoral strength of the United States is still in what is now the industrial sector of the country, and these people, they don't want to have anything to do with it. Okay? The popular vote is fairly close. I mean, William Jennings Bryan gets within 4 points. He loses 47 to 51 to McKinley, but the electoral votes, they're really not all that close because the states that he's winning are a lot less populated than what you're going to see here, the ones that McKinley is going to carry. So the electoral strength just completely doesn't work in Bryan's favor. So populism doesn't really win. So that's the end of this section.